Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So you can kick off whenever you're ready.
Kick off. This episode feels very surreal for me because it is the final episode of In Other News, the podcast. Yes, the final episode. Very, very surreal and definitely an end of an era. But before I get into all of that, to close out this chapter, felt timely and felt like an exciting new step. But before I get into all that's next, etc., I asked a handful of In Other News guests, and by guests I mean people I've written about and people that I've also featured on the podcast, to ask me a question. And this episode is going to be me answering their questions. So if you see me look down, it's because there's loads of questions and I cannot remember all of them off by heart. So I'm going to start with question 1 is from Casey Alicia, who is a tour manager. She's founder of Casey Alicia Books, Love Thy Throw, the play and the book, and many other things. She featured on episode 10, 11. She featured in the Networking Across event and also featured on the Ladies Night IG Live. So she's been on here a lot. Her question is if you could do a part 2 to any interview or conversation you've had, which would it be and why? So I'd actually do a Where Are They Now with everyone, because the podcast and the platform started 6 years ago. So 6 years? 7 years ago, actually. Started 7 years ago. So much has happened in life. Like, to think that I started this when we didn't have a pandemic. Like, life has changed so much since then. So I'd probably do a Where Are They Now with everybody that I've ever written about or ever featured on the podcast. But an episode that actually really stood out to me is a Black Love episode. So I did an episode, I want to say 2019, definitely pre-pandemic, with 3 different couples at 3 different stages in their relationships. So at the time, Ramel and Coriel were girlfriend and boyfriend. Jade and Rez were engaged, and Amani and Ashley were married. And since then, they've all moved on to like the traditional next step. So Amani and Ashley have become parents. Jade and Rez have got married and become parents, and Ramel and Coriel have got married. So I'd be interested to hear how their relationships have shifted through those transitions. But generally, I would actually do a Where Are They Now with everyone. The next question is from Leanne Perot, who's the founder of The Movement Factory and Black Women Rising, and she featured on episode 20. Her question is, if you could go back to when you started the In Other News journey, what would be 3 pieces of advice you would give yourself? First piece of advice I'd give myself is stay on top of your account so you don't get fined. Like, practically, like, that was really annoying when I got those letters, and I was kind of taking it seriously but not taking it seriously, but then it got very serious when I got a fine. So that would be a definite piece of advice I would give. Another piece of advice I would give is delegate as soon as you can. So find people and think about building a tribe around yourself. Well, I'd think about building a tribe around myself, of people that I can work alongside or can work alongside me earlier. And I think it's good not only for delegating tasks, but just like delegating thought. Like, sometimes as a solo entrepreneur or someone that runs something by themselves, and whether it's an entrepreneurial venture or not, you've got so many ideas in your brain, and sometimes like just having a person to like tell that idea to is helpful. So just having a bit more of a like a sounding board of community, or like not even tapping into that community, because I definitely have people I could have done that with, and I think that would have helped take the pressure off my own brain and into spaces with other minds. And another piece of advice I would give myself is affirm yourself more than you compare yourself. And as much as people always say comparison is the thief of joy, I definitely agree, especially when it comes to comparing yourself to other people. But unfortunately, it does become a way of life, and it has been a way of life for me, especially growing up. I compared myself a lot, but I think in growing wiser, as Laura Jane always says, you don't grow older, you grow wiser. In growing wiser, I realised that comparing myself might just reduce. It might continue like our whole lives, But if you affirm yourself more, it feels like you're comparing yourself less. So I think that would be the third piece of advice I would give. Abby is the next question. She's one of my best friends, and she's an English teacher and deputy head of year. Deputy head teacher, I hope I got that right. She featured on episode 13, 14, 23, and also in the Black in Quarantine IG live series as part of the Key Workers edition. So again, another person that's featured a lot. Her question is, if you had a billboard in Leicester Square for the day, what would you display on it? I would display an AI sign that says in other news, and then inside the letters would be pictures or like clips of interviews and events that I've done. And then as you're looking at the sign, the images come out, so it almost looks like they're coming out into the street. So if you're a child, like if you're a child, you'd probably feel like you could like reach out and touch it. But I'd probably have something like that where it's like a blank screen that's just yellow, and then in other news would come out in the colours, etc., etc. And then inside the letters would be clips of like stuff I've done. So that would be what would be for the day. Nesta McGregor, he is an entertainment reporter at BBC Radio 1, and he featured early on in episode 5. And his question is, when was the last time you cried and why? The last time I cried was when I watched The Colour Purple and Fantasia sang I Am Here. And the reason I cried is because I don't know Fantasia yet, but I followed her journey since American Idol, and to see just the journey of her as a woman, as a black woman in entertainment, as, all of the things that she is. When she sang that song in that film, I feel like it just wasn't like a song in a film. It was like a personal affirmation for her. And obviously her voice is like insane. Like that woman can sing. And when she sang that in that film, I was literally like, I just felt like I knew her personally. And I just felt like I knew that she meant those words, not only to make her character in the film convincing, but it, as I said, like an affirmation for herself. So that was the last time I cried. The next question is from Terry Louise, who is another good friend of mine and the founder of Talks with MS. She featured in episode 17. Her question is, what was your why when building your platform? I had a few whys, but the main why was that I wanted to depict various versions of Black British success. I felt like Black success was always painted in an American lens, and also it really only focused heavily on entertainment, media, sports, TV, like the arts. And I felt really strongly that there's so many people, especially within my like immediate community, that I felt like were trailblazing in their own way, whether they were a teacher, whether they were running a swimming collective, whether they were an entrepreneur, whether they were in sport, whether they were in media, whether they were just a thought leader, all of these different things. And I just felt like there wasn't at the time a space where all of those versions of Black British success particularly was easily accessible. So that was part of my why. And the other part was that I wanted to feature Black British success at various stages in the journey. I think that it's become more common now to talk to people, especially from a podcast space, who are at various stages of the journey. But I remember when I started out, I felt like anyone that ever did an interview was kind of at a particular level in their career. And I felt that it was really important to showcase all of the different stages, because all of them have wisdom and all of them can be learned from. And yeah, that was really important to me as well in terms of a why. The next question is from Raphael, who is the co-founder of Temple. And he featured in episode 40. His question is, if money was unlimited, what is the most ridiculous and irrational things you would buy or do with it? Irrationally, I'd actually travel everywhere by air, first of all, beat the traffic. And I actually love seeing the world from a higher viewpoint, whether it's a jet, whether it's a helicopter. I would actually just travel everywhere by air. Another irrational thing I would do is buy a big cat. I'd buy like a jaguar, a black panther, a tiger, or something like that and have it as a pet. Another irrational thing I would do. So thinking about what irrational things I would do was interesting to think about. But they're the two main things that for me irrationally I would do. Other things I would do if money was no object is that I'd actually just elevate the areas of my life that already exist. So I would just do everything but at like 2 or 3 levels up. I'd eat out all the time. I'd have a chef, I'd have a personal trainer, I'd have a nutritionist, so hopefully that person could be a chef as well. I'd have a driver or a pilot in my case, in terms of irrational. I would have a spa inside my house. I'd pay off all of the like excessive debt that my loved ones have. Again, these aren't irrational things. These are just things I would do when I have, not even if, when I have like additional income. Yeah, they're the things I'd do. And then apart from that, I'd like invest, etc., etc. Another thing I'd actually do is buy some land on the outskirts of the Caribbean and begin like a new private island where people could go and feel like very serene, but also have places where they could create. I'd develop a new holiday destination. I'd also go to the moon, actually. Yeah, I'd also go to the moon and maybe try and touch one of the other planets. That would be interesting to me. Question 7 from Philippa, another one of my best friends and the founder of Feel Good Drinks. She featured, which is the best rum punch, by the way. She featured on episode 23. Her question is, if you could sum up In Other News in 3 words, what would they be? And why have you chosen these words? The 3 words I would sum up In Other News with are community, integrity, and humanity. Community, because I had a really special moment. So when I did the first Black in Quarantine IG Live, a girl messaged me off the back of the live I did with the first one. So that one was with Bissy Atkins, Jacqueline Shepherd, and Julie Adenuga. And after that, she DM'd me, a girl that just followed the journey. I didn't know her, and just a wider part of the community. And she DM'd me to say that the pandemic had really been rough for her. She felt like she was just losing people week after week after week. People were catching the virus and just passing away. Work was stressful, all of the things. And then for whatever reason, she just decided to come on Instagram and she caught part of the conversation I was having with Julie. And she said that's the most joy that she's had in that period at that time. And I just remember thinking, so much of this is beyond me. And also that thing of like, you just never know what someone's going through, and you also never know, in you just being you or doing what you're doing can add a little bit of joy and hope to their day. And also wider community in terms of all of the amazing people I've met along the way. Integrity, for me, that's another word that I'd use because I want to make sure that everyone I interview feels like I've done their story justice. I did have one occasion where someone did say, when I sent them the write-up, this was like pre-podcast days, I sent them the write-up and they essentially said that they didn't say that. And one thing about me, I'm going to have the receipt, honey. So I found the recording and sent them the clip of what they said and then paired it with what I'd written. And then they came back and was like, oh, apologies, blah, blah. I actually think they didn't realize they were that transparent. As opposed to they thought I was lying. But yeah, apart from that, and that's all fine now as well. But apart from that, I pride myself in making sure that people feel like when they watch back the conversation, they feel like, yeah, that's an accurate depiction of the conversation we had and the story. And humanity, I think is really important to, when doing a podcast, it depends on the intention of the podcast really, is to allow it to be a space where people can show all of the emotions that they need to show as part of that conversation. So I've had like big belly laughs, we've had tears, we've had like pensive, don't really know what the answer to that question is. And yeah, I really feel like conversation, like the art of conversation, not even the art, the heart of conversation is emotion. And that for me is where the humanity comes in. The next question is from Bisola. So Bis, in my life, good friend of mine, founder of Safe House. And she featured on the panel of the Black and Creative Live event and also on episode 15. Her question is, what was the most pinnacle moment for you during the In Other News journey so far and why? And what essential component or components do you feel are required to progress or help grow the brand? So in terms of pinnacle moments, I feel like I've had a few. One of them was definitely when I got my first PR invite, and that was to the Black Magic Awards, which was curated by Kojo Anim and Anika Allen. And it was an award show essentially highlighting all of the amazing things that Black people are doing in entertainment and various different industries. And that was really pinnacle because I felt not that award shows should validate work, but there is an element of validation that comes with being invited to something like that. So yeah, that was definitely a pinnacle moment. And another pinnacle moment, I actually, in interviewing Nesta, I met Janet Jackson. So I'll take you back through the story. So I originally organised to interview Nesta McGregor, and in organising that, I said to him, like, look, we'll meet at the said place and do the interview there. It was a really quiet, like, lobby area at Regent Street Cinema, which is really quiet, and we were also doing it at like a really dead time of the day. I'd gone there, I'd seen the space, I could see where I was going to record it, all of the things, and also it was up the road from where he's based. He said, cool, blah, blah, blah. He comes to where we're about to record, and a group of elderly people come into the cinema for a special screening of a film that day. I was like, of all days for this to happen, and they were just like, now she would, like, you're chatting in the lobby area. I was also mindful that I was up against the clock based on the fact that he had to get back to work. All of these things are happening. And that was the time when I realized, you know what, it's so important to have a plan B. So I didn't have a plan B. So I was just going to hope that he was free to continue after they'd gone into the film. Instead, he said, you know what, like, are you pushed for time? And I was like, no. Then he said, okay, do you want to come over and record the episode at BBC? So at this point, I'm thinking, huh? Little old me at the time coming over to record my podcast episode with him at BBC. He was like, yeah, like, there's bound to be a studio free. So we went into BBC and recorded it in one of the BBC studios. And just before we were recording, someone was doing one of those, like, announcements about traffic and the weather and all of that kind of stuff. And I was like, this is mad. Anyway, we did the recording. Obviously, the mic is so crisp. If you go back and listen to that episode, you'll definitely hear the difference. So crisp, a great conversation. And then he said, let me take you around the building. Took me around the building, he showed me all the different pictures, etc. And then we get to one of the studios, and just before we walk past it, Trevor Nelson comes out. So then I'm like, can't believe it. And then he introduces me to Trevor Nelson, and I say hi, blah, blah, blah. And then Trevor Nelson says, Janet Jackson's in there. So I was like, what? Honestly, I was like, no way, no actual way. And then literally like 30 seconds later, Janet Jackson literally, like, it's almost like she had a light around her and she just swanned out of the studio. And obviously she's so soft-spoken, she's very pleasant, and she just waved at us and said hi. I literally was like I was so shocked. I think I just went like that, honestly. And then I looked at Nesta, and then he said to me, another day in the office. And I was like, this is crazy. So I'd definitely say that's another pinnacle moment. And also hosting my first event. I think that was special because, I think that was special for a number of reasons. So yeah, they're pinnacle moments. Components for growing a brand. I think one of the things is having a really clear North Star, having a really clear intention about what you want the brand to say and what you want the brand to do and the impact you want the brand to have. And mine was, like I answered in the previous question, like amplifying the various versions of Black British success. And also, I think in terms of another component to help grow a brand is consistency. It's that age-old thing of doing something over and over and over again. There's a saying that says, hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. So it's that essence of like, I guess we maybe see it in the music industry a little bit, in terms of people that might not be considered the best singers, but they can't be ignored because they are consistent. Another thing is commitment. And I think it's that consistency as well, and also staying committed when it's not fun. That's really important, because it's not going to feel like fun and exciting all the time. But I think if you know what that North Star is and you're committed to that and seeing that through to how long you feel like you need to, then you'll go far. The next question is from Jamelia. She's another best friend of mine and the founder of Treasure Tress. She featured in a blog article early doors on episode 10, 11, 23, and also in the Black in Quarantine Business Edition. Her question is, what is the greatest lesson the podcast has taught you so far? I would say that is the importance and power of communication and connection. And the reason I say that is because in a time where we're somewhat encouraged to be more disconnected, because there's so much that we can connect to with not having to actually talk to somebody, in terms of all of the different apps that are coming out, social media platforms that make you feel hyper connected but equally hyper disconnected at the same time. I've had a few moments when doing this podcast, and after the conversation the guest has hung around and we've continued talking, or when I'm just before we wrap, they're huh, we're finishing already. So I think that's the greatest lesson, that people still do want to connect in person. People do still care about person-to-person interaction, and also the importance of creating a safe space for people to do that and feel like they can share and they can be vulnerable. They can do their normal laugh. They can do all of those type of things. So yeah, I would definitely say that's one of the greatest lessons. Tula is the founder of Tulian and another great friend of mine. She featured on episode 21. Her question is what are you most proud of in your journey with In Other News? What do you feel is the legacy of In Other News as it stands? What do you feel you've left with people? So that's a loaded question. What am I most proud of? I'd say consistency. The consistency to keep going, similar to what I was saying with Biss's question. It's easy to keep going when things seem to be going really well. But the true test is to keep going when they don't feel like they're going so well. And it's that whole thing of commitment is doing what you know you need to do, even when you don't want to do it. And creating that habit. And I think although that most humans are creatures of habit, I think we're hardwired generally to stop doing something when it stops being fun. And I think I'm proud that I kept going when it didn't feel fun. In terms of the legacy, I'd say connectivity, and the connectivity of the In Other News community, and also the people that I've highlighted on the platform, and also the interconnectivity, so the people I've met along the way. So an example of interconnectivity, I met a young girl called Delenn, who had just come out of college. I met her at the Teen Experience, which is a Treasure Tress initiative, painting her nails. Yeah. We got chatting. She was telling me about all the things she's interested in, one of which was taking pictures. I told her I run a podcast. Do you want to get some experience and take pictures at my podcast? She said, yeah. I said, cool. She then went on to work at a creative agency called Threads. As a result of her working at Threads, that was run by Andre Modeste and Jay London. Then she reached out to me, excuse me, to interview Jay London as part of a documentary he was doing. Excuse me. And as I interviewed him, I then met Andre, who now has become a good friend of mine, who then who's a photographer, creative director, etc. And then he then went on to take my first set of headshots. Delenn then went on to run her own creative agency called Altworld. Very long story. However, the point I'm making is that the interconnectivity of that is something I'm really proud of. And I think there's been a number of examples from an In Other News point of view where that has happened. What do I feel like I've left with people? My hope is that I've left a blueprint that demonstrates the importance of seeing and advocating value to everyone's story, not just the people at the top. And I also hope I've demonstrated the variety of Black British success. That's the thing I hope. The next question is from Nathaniel and P, who are the founders of Swim Them Crew, a swimming collective, and they featured in an article, Early Doors as well. Their question is, were you born with your foresight, or is it something you've had to improve on? We asked this because you were one of the first people to pick up on what we were doing and talk about it on our terms, and in media that rarely happens. So how do you keep your finger on the pulse? First of all, thank you for saying that, in terms of being one of the first to talk about your story on your own terms. And that goes back to the integrity answer I gave before. That's really important to me, so I'm glad that you felt that. In terms of did I have foresight, I don't think so. To be honest, I don't think so. In terms of like, how do I keep my finger on the pulse? Generally, I'm quite a connected person. So that goes back to the interconnectivity point I made previously. And as a result of my desire to amplify successful Black Brits that weren't just in entertainment and media, I actually paid really close attention to things that were happening outside of that culture, which is how I came across you guys. So yeah, that would be how I kept my finger on it, because I was purposely, naturally, you're kind of fed information from people who are in sport, media, art, so you have to make an intentional effort to look outside of that, and I did that. But yeah, in terms of foresight, I don't know. I don't think I was born with it. Their next question is something we're also interested in. What is success to you? We asked this because as you're about to close a huge chapter and believe that such a change can bring about a lot of emotions, but can you look back on this time and say that In Other News was successful by your standards? Did your measure of success change over time? So in terms of success and what that metric was, I didn't really have any. I definitely used the first 2 years for just vibes, to see what landed, to see what worked, to see what went well, and just like move with the times as well. So as you guys all know, I interviewed you guys as a written article, but in doing that, I recorded our conversation and then transcribed it all. And then as content consumption was changing, I realized I need to just kill two birds with one stone and actually put this audio recording on a platform that can turn into a podcast. And that for me was like an example of changing the metrics of success, like moving with the time. I think making sure that the depiction of Black success was varied was also important. And I think the Black in Quarantine IG live series was a good example of that. There was various different industries I covered. It was 12 weeks straight. So there was Black in Quarantine, the broadcasting, key workers, fitness, barbering, community, entrepreneurship, expats, international, some of the others. But yeah, that was a good example of that. And for me, in answer to your second part of your question, in terms of can I look back at this time and think that In Other News was successful? I would say yes. Naturally, there's more that could be done. I could have done loads of other things, etc., etc. But for me, by definition, success is now living a fulfilling life wholeheartedly, and knowing the versions of yourself that you enjoy most and allowing you to be that version of yourself as often as possible. I think it's also about, success for me is also about like paying attention to the themes in your life. Like, I don't necessarily think we all have to do a thing, but I think there's naturally a theme that seems to will follow you. So for example, I think one of my purpose themes is storytelling. And I think the first time I noticed that in myself was as a dancer. Because when you dance, you're telling a story. And if nothing else, you're depicting the story that's been told in the music through movement. And I think that's one of my themes. And as a result, going into journalism, again, it's about storytelling. Podcasting, again, is about storytelling. And In Other News, at its core, is about sharing a story. So, I definitely think following that hum, for me, has meant that on my terms, In Other News has been successful. The next question is from Jacqueline Shepherd, and she is a broadcaster at BBC Radio London, and she featured on the Black in Quarantine Broadcasters Edition, and her question is, what are you most scared of right now? I think just the constant war is, becoming becoming increasingly more concerning to me. Yeah, I'd say that. Because I just think it's it's a matter of time before it gets really close to home. And it only seems like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it, until it's on your doorstep. Not that I'm wishing that, but yeah, that's what's, I think, would I say it's something I'm scared of? I don't think scared is the word. I think more like hurt and disappointed and yeah, those kind of words are more what I think. But in terms of in my life, is there anything I'm scared of? No. But I definitely think it's been a journey to get there in terms of feeling that. But yeah, that's probably the best answer to that question. So the next question is from Laulu, who's the founder of Neo Enterprise, and she featured on episode 16. And her question is, what have you loved most about the process, and how has the journey changed you? I think what I've loved most is refining processes. So actually stopping the process being like super clunky to like understanding how I can make it feel a bit more seamless, because processes are part of doing anything and it can feel like laborious, boring, all of those things. But it's really important to get those things clean. I also have enjoyed meeting new people, like at a very basic level, like meeting you, meeting everyone else that I didn't know ahead of time. How has the journey changed me? In so many ways, to be honest. I think it's changed me primarily in my ability to not that this didn't happen before, but have really genuine conversations with strangers. Because it's easy to do that when you know people, you know their ways, you know their like irks, you know their vibe. But with a complete stranger, it definitely takes, and that's why I've got so much respect for people who interview just generally, because it takes a lot of, one, preparation, but two, real trust from the other person that they can sit in front of you. And in a lot of my interviews, I actually don't send the guests the questions ahead of time unless they ask. And like maybe one person, two people ask. Like generally people just trust that they're going to come and they're going to feel comfortable asking. Granted, I do always say, if I ask you anything that feels incriminating or you don't want to talk about, we can move on. But to date, that hasn't happened. So I also think that has changed me in terms of refining that process around continuing to create a safe space for people to come and share what I ask. The next question is from Jeffrey, who is a health and wellness expert, and he featured on episode 35. His question is, what were the biggest and most practical takeaways regarding health from our conversation, and which ones have you aimed to implement and benefit from your life? In your life going forward? I think was paying attention to my circadian clock, and I feel very educated when I say circadian clock, because basically what that means is like your sleep cycle. So knowing when your body's getting tired and knowing when it's time to wake up, and everybody's got like an internal one of those that just keeps them, essentially keeps them going. Jeffrey, I really hope I explained that properly. But basically it's your body clock. And that is something I paid more attention to, because I just would sleep anytime and be annoyed when I'm so tired in the morning. But paying more attention to that, I've had better sleep, deeper sleep. I feel more energized in the morning, all those type of things that your parents try to drill into you when you used to stay up playing the Nintendo DS under the sheets and were late for school. So basically that, and also something that we spoke about, just even off camera, in terms of diversifying the type of food that's on the plate. And one of the things you actually encouraged me to do was to buy something at my next food shop that I'd never cooked with before, and just add it to my meal and use that as a way to like add more, diversity to my plate. And I've done that, and that's been, really interesting. And also, I've actually enjoyed being a lot more experimental with what I cook. And also from like a nutritional point of view, like super helpful. The next question is from Jan Genesis, who is my cousin, and also a multi-camera director. He featured in a blog article, and also we did a special with him, episodes 36 to 39. And he said, having spoken to so many unsung creatives over the past 4 to 5 years, who has had the biggest impact on your own journey and why? So I think this question, everybody has had an impact. And I know that seems like the generic answer, but everybody truly has. And whether it's the way that they've lived their life and learning more about that. Like either you can learn from something, or you can, there's advice given and advice taken, but also there's always something that can be learned if you're listening. So everybody has taught me something. But although I never got a chance to actually interview him, I would actually say my dad. And 30 years ago, he started a golf association with his boys to bring more black men onto the golf course, based on their experiences when they used to go and play. The snubs, the dismissal, the racism, all of the things. But he really loved the game. Like him and 4 of his friends really loved the game. So he wanted to change the narrative and accessibility to the sport. And 32 years later, the AGCA, which stands for the Afro-Caribbean Golf Association, is still running. And it's got new members, and they still do special tournaments, dinners, trips abroad, all of that kind of stuff. And I think I used to even you, cuz you, aside from the main part of the AGCA, my dad also started a junior version called Junior Eagles, where essentially it was getting inner city kids into the game as well. And actually, Jan designed the logo for that. And I used to go and be like the front of house kind of thing. So I would just traipse every single Sunday to Lea Bridge Road and taking the register, giving everybody clubs, making sure everybody paid, all of that kind of stuff. That Junior Eagles doesn't exist anymore, but the AGCA still does. And I think every year they have a tournament in my dad's honour. And I always go there and present the trophy. We actually did it in February, just gone, for this year's one. And he was the first person that I saw that committed to being the change he wanted to see. So I would say him as a benchmark. The other person culturally, I would say is Jamal Edwards. And one of the things he says, and like a common quote that he's always said, is the goal isn't to live forever, but to create something that will. And both my dad and Jamal have both done that. So yeah, that's the answer to that question. The next question is actually from Abdul, who does most of the videography and editing for the pod. And I think this actually came from his missus as opposed to from him. But the question is, what's your opinion on men's contraception and why vasectomies aren't popular for long-term couples? So this is a big old question. But I think in short, I don't know enough about it to have a full opinion. But I think on a surface level, I think it's ultimately up to the couple to decide on their family planning process and what that includes. But yeah, if I knew more, I'd give more. But I don't know more. And the next question is from Trina, who is the founder of the Curve Catwalk. She featured in episodes 7 and 8. And she said, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to your younger self? In short, being yourself is the mood. It really is the mood. I'd also say, don't be dissuaded from being intelligent. And I think growing up especially, I had a lot of people tell me, like, why do you talk like that? Or like, you sound like, you don't really sound like a black person. Or like, you kind of sound white. Like, how come you speak like that? And I used to think, this is just my voice. Like, this is just how I speak. And I think that it's really important to not let things like that affect your confidence. And I allowed it to when I was young. Now, I couldn't care less. And also, I would say, continue to always lean into the things that bring you joy, even if it doesn't bring you revenue. Because so much of our lives, especially as we get older, are about like what's going to bring in the bag, which is essential. But also to have like a fulfilling life, I think there's things that you should just do just for the hell of it, for the love of it, and not just because you want to. And yeah, I'd definitely say those things. The next question is from Amani Simpson, who is my godbrother and also an entrepreneur and film producer. He featured on episode 18, 19, and the Black in Quarantine Freelancers edition. And his question is, what is your favourite memory and or achievement since starting In Other News? What have you learned about yourself since starting? One of my favourites is definitely hosting my first event at Havas, which is a global ad agency. I think having that allyship so early on in the journey was really special to me. And yeah, being able to essentially kind of do what I wanted in the space and then just kind of back that decision was important. The story I said about the Nesta McGregor interview when I met Janet Jackson, that's definitely one. What have I learned about myself so far? Similar to a previous question, my interview style, I've seen it refine over time. And I've also learned like the more that you treat an interview like an actual conversation, the more organic it feels to watch, listen to, etc. So the next question is from T, who's an actor who I did a written blog about. And it was actually about his community initiative called The Give Back, which I'm part of. His question is, if you were to have 3 dinner guests, dead or alive, what would you cook for all 3 guests? And in terms of choosing your guests, one has to be based on intellect, one has to be based on attraction, and one has to be based on a random reason. T would ask a question like this. It's a great question. The first one, and this is the guest for intellect, would be a lady called Felicia Hatcher, who is the CEO of Pharrell Williams' Black Ambition Opportunity Fund. She's a speaker, author, businesswoman, etc. And I actually discovered her on a viral TikTok clip when she was speaking about something. And one of the things she said was to have a bigger life, you have to ask yourself and life bigger questions. And one of the questions that she asked was, who are you uninterrupted? It's a question I've never heard before. And I thought, that's interesting. So it told me that she's got like a really interesting way of thinking about things and really considered way of thinking about things. And as much as I think that sometimes interruption builds character and also can be a form of protection, what I really liked about that question, that it was a big question and as a result it required a big answer. And when I've kind of looked at her wider work, I think she's an extremely intelligent Black woman. So yeah, that would be guess 1. Guess for attraction would be Tupac. I would just sit at the table and look at him, and that's the end of that. And also, I'd want to ask him about life before death, ultimately, because I assumed that I would be meeting him not on this side of life. I'd be meeting him when he was still alive. T, you're not asking me if he came back, right? Anyway, that's how I'm interpreting it. And the random guest would be David Attenborough, because I think he's got a very iconic voice. And I'd also want to learn more about the animal kingdom and what was his fascination growing up. Like, where did that come from? And also any parallels that he has been able to draw between the animal kingdom and human life. And I think those 3 people and me at a table, I couldn't even tell you where the conversation would go. And that's what's interesting to me about that. So yeah, Felicia Hatcher, Tupac, and David Attenborough. What I would cook, I reckon I'd make like tapas style dining. So a couple things that you can just nibble at. So like a prawn something, a chicken something, like a potato something. I'd make tapas style. So like not a 3 course, I'd make like nibble type of food. I'd definitely like something with lobster in it though. But ultimately I'd have to check dietary requirements. But anyway, it would be tapas style food. Kajari is the next question, and she's the founder of Kajari Made It. So all of those like hilariously, like culturally relevant graphics that you see on Instagram, that's Kajari. She was on episode 28, and her question is, are there specific lessons or insights from the past 6 years that you'll carry into this new chapter? Main one, maintaining connection. So at the top of last year, I said I was going to reconnect. I said to myself, you know what, I'm going to reconnect with everyone I've interviewed over the years and see how they are. But then when I deeped it, I realised I was still connected to at least 85% of those people. So I realised, I'm more connected than I thought I was. Yeah, I definitely want to maintain that moving into the next chapter. And also a lesson. So Selma Nichols, who runs Looks Like Me, once said to me, if you're doing something for free, know why you're doing it for free, not because you don't know how to ask for money. And I thought, it's so facts, because sometimes you just want to do it. And actually maybe if you ask, is there a budget? They might say yeah. Or But if you're going to do something for no money, know why you're doing it for no money. And I felt like that's been really poignant. The next question is from Ramel London. She's a presenter and founder of The Mainstream. She featured on episode 10, 11, 30 and the Black in Quarantine's Freelancers edition. And she said, what's your favourite thing about your podcast? Ultimately, being nosy. Asking questions about people's life and understanding their context, understanding how they came to be who they are, understanding why they decided to start particular businesses, ventures, and also learning about the random like isms in people's life. Richie Brave is a great example of that. When I sent him what we were talking about on the podcast, based on what we came away having talked about, was nothing that was on that sheet. And I've often, I never really write like a script. I'll write a framework of like where I want to get to, but I don't write a script. I don't like pre-write questions. I just allow the conversation to flow. But I always know I want to get to this point in the end. So yeah, I'd definitely say it's about being nosy. Warren James is question 23, and he's the co-founder of an LA-based like community events company, activations, etc., called Toasted Life, and he featured on the Black in Quarantine Expats edition. His question is self-perception, and has it changed? What are some of the ways you viewed yourself before becoming an entrepreneur, during the journey, and what is your perception now? So ultimately, this is layered. And I think to answer it without necessarily unpacking all of the layers, it's about like embracing all of the versions of yourself. And that like as you continue to embrace them, trusting that the evolution is going to lead you to the next place. So like I always knew in terms of what was my perception before becoming an entrepreneur and kind of running in other news, I always knew that I was never going to go like the super traditional way in terms of like career. My brain was I was too interested in too many things to just narrow in on something early on in my life. So I was definitely always the person that was switching jobs a lot, trying to do new things, switching industry, all of that kind of thing. And I think as a creative person, you naturally have that. And one of the things that I think becomes a superpower as a creative person is your ability to narrow in and is your ability to just stick to one thing, because we're so multifaceted and there's so much going on in our brain all the time. I think during the journey, in terms of self-perception, it showed me that I can narrow in and I can focus and I can commit to one particular line of work. And what is my perception now? My perception now is that I can give myself the agency to change direction. I think so often we think that we have to see things through to the end, and you can decide that end if you started it. So yeah, I've just decided that now it's more of a pause than an end. But yeah, that's my perception now in terms of like giving myself the agency to make that new decision. So the second part of Warren's question is, what is your perspective on self-perception and how that can affect positively and or negatively on someone's growth and opportunity and expansion? Okay, so in short, how can how we see ourselves positively or negatively affect us? And ultimately, like how we see ourselves is part of the direction our life takes. And I didn't really believe that for a long time. It's that whole thing of like how you speak about yourself also affects the life that you live and how you see yourself and the opportunities that come to you and the like your own self-respect, the respect other people give you, all of these type of things. And I think for me, I wasn't always very kind to myself. And internally, I know how that had affected my self-worth and self-value. And as a Christian, I massively believe in like the power of God and like the power of words, and knowing that like God doesn't call you like what you've done or who you are. He actually calls you what he created, which is like above and not beneath, the head and not the tail, like all of these like affirming things. And when I remind myself of that, I generally feel more at home in myself, which has led me to have a more optimistic outlook on my own life. And as a result of that, I feel like my life has become more optimistic. Do I think I should have thought about this earlier on in my life? Nah. And the reason I say that is because I feel also very strongly that everything happens when it's supposed to. I don't think anything happens before it's meant to. So I feel like I was meant to get to this point in self right now. So yeah, thanks for that. Renee is the next question. She's another good friend of mine and founder of Out the Box. She featured on episode 20. Black in Quarantine, the community edition, and also the Networking Across event. Her question is, you've been super consistent in the quality of guests from all industries and practices. Thanks for noticing. What's been a consistent theme or thread between them all? I.e., what do you feel is a common attribute that amounts to their success? I'll boil it down to 3, I think. It kind of links to Warren's question. Self-belief. I think there is something insanely powerful about believing in yourself and believing in the person that you are and the impact you can have, and being relentless about that. So Busta Rhymes on Stephen Bartlett's podcast was talking about how when he started in the rap game, he was just so different to everyone else. Like, obviously he had dreads, he was really animated, he also had a very, like, you could feel the influence, the Jamaican influence as well, and just generally from the outlook of rap, he was just so far left from everyone else. He's actually one of my favorite rappers to this day. And he said that initially people will call you crazy, and then when it works, people will call you a genius. And I think that self-belief is what propels that kind of like crazy to genius. I think resilience is one of the things I've seen in everyone. Just that ability to keep going when it's not sexy, when it's not fun, when it is fun, managing ego as well, and then also doing something that is of service, knowing that what the impact you're making on the world is actually helping someone else. And everyone I've interviewed to some degree, whether their business is like immediately about service or as a result of who they are, if they're a thought leader or a presenter or something like that, in how they present, their way of thinking, etc. Like, they naturally become of service to someone else who maybe wants to get into presenting or wants to get into their industry, etc. So I'd say, yeah, self-belief, resilience, and being of service. Jermaine Craig is the next question, number 25, and he is the founder of Convo, and he actually featured on episode 25. His question is, what are 2 non-typical characteristics or quirks you admire in people? Mystery is one. So someone that's, kind of self-explanatory, someone that seems mysterious, is interesting to me. And also, it's the next one, it's an endearing quality, someone that's a little bit clumsy. I think it's just, when you watch them like trying to do something and they like knock into a wall or something, I think, oh, that's so sweet. And I think maybe like that element of like children is what I find like most heartwarming. When I see kids doing something, then all of a sudden they just like slip, or all of a sudden they're like looking at something and they go into the wall. Although that sounds crazy, I just think that clumsiness, do you know what it is? I think less than clumsy, I think it's childlike nature. I'd maybe say that. See, a mystery and a childlike nature, those things are characteristics I admire in people. And the next question is from Ola Christian, another friend and founder of LaVille. He featured in the Networking Across event, and his question is, what was the biggest thing you learned from one of your guests that you could go away and apply to your everyday life? And what was the biggest challenge recording your podcast? The second part of the question, very easy, sticking to time. Whether that's like sticking to time in actually the conversation, sticking to time in terms of how long we've got to record, that is hard, because as people start to open up, like I feel like I don't want to cut you off as you're about to like open up about something, but I'm also no, we're kind of against the clock. So yeah, sticking to time is difficult practically. Biggest thing I learned from one of my guests that I can go away and apply to everyday life, I can't actually think of one thing. Everybody has said something that has shaped how I see whatever they were talking about. I'd have to really go back and listen to everybody's again. But yeah, I would say, answer the question, sticking to time, is the biggest challenge from recording a podcast, or also when there's a technical problem or a technical glitch. That is long. Like when the audio, something happens to the audio, something happens to the camera, all of that, yeah, that is long. And then, yeah, I think everyone's taught me something. Question 27 is from IC Music, who is the founder of The Sit Down, and I interviewed him in a blog article. His question is, how do you know when to keep going with a dream and when to put it down? What are the signs you look out for? And then the second part is, if you could ask God one question about the next 5 years of your life, what specifically would you ask? So the first part is, how do you know when to keep going and what are the signs to look out for? I think this is layered because I don't think it's a fixed answer. For me personally, I was doing a lot of thinking about my life holistically, and I just felt like it needed rebranding, so to speak. And I wanted to do something new. I wanted to do something different. And I knew that I felt like something else was pulling me towards it, and I knew I couldn't do that, which is the next thing I'm going on to, and also running in other news successfully. I also knew that in terms of a team, in order to do both, I would need one, and I don't have one. So I knew that I had to just make a choice. Signs to look out for is interesting. So I think it's about discernment, because discernment, as opposed to like a clear sign, because if you're doing something that you're passionate about and it's adding value and all of the good things, it's easy to think you should keep going forever. But I think applying discernment, because discernment's that thing of like, you don't have to discern a thing that looks like categorically wrong or categorically right. You have to discern something that could be right, or you have to discern something that could be wrong. And you've got to know, you kind of got to just trust your judgment. And if I could ask God a question about the next 5 years of my life, what would I ask? Interestingly, I don't think I would ask him anything, because I'm mindful of like the question I ask and what he might say. This is like a really like random and like semi-unnecessary question. If I asked, will I be a millionaire? And he said no. Like, I'd be like, oh. But ultimately, it might be that I'd be a billionaire instead. But just because he said no, doesn't mean I won't be. Do you get it? So for me, I'm like, I actually think, if anything, I might just ask him a question about like something really general. Like, am I living the life I'm fulfilled by? And if he said yes, I'd be like, great. If he said no, I would do everything in my power between now and 5 years from today to live a fulfilling life, because I know that on that 5 year mark, the answer is no. So I'd want to make sure that everything is fulfilled up until then. So yeah, maybe I'd ask him that. But anything else, yeah, I'm happy to just roll the punches. Famous last words. Danielle Ennis is the next question. She's a great friend of mine. She's a coach, an innovator, and an author. She featured on episode 3, 7, 8, and the Black in Quarantine Key Workers edition. Her question is, how would you like your listeners to continue to live out the message and ethos of In Other News? In short, I would like people to remember that value should be attributed to people for who they are, as opposed to what they do. And I tried to make that visible in the type of guests I had. So I didn't always interview entrepreneurs. I interviewed my brethrens. Like, there was an episode where I did a conversation with my 6 best friends, and we just talked about friendship. So it was about who they are to me, as opposed to what they all do. And yeah, that's the thing that I would like people to continue. And especially as we're kind of in a world where a lot of value is attributed to what you do. And yeah, that would be the thing. Like, treat people for who they are, not what they do. Kalia Ismain is the founder of Jammy, and her question's next. She featured in a blog article and also on episode 20. Her question is, what has been the biggest personal lesson that running In Other News has given you? Motivation is like gold dust, and discipline is really the key. I don't believe that it's sustainable to do something only when you're motivated, because you're going to be motivated sometimes and demotivated sometimes. I think it's about developing discipline and knowing that, like, this has to be done regardless. And by this, it could be today it's 100%, another day it's 20%, another day it's 35%, another day it's 17%, another day it's 1%. But I think relying on motivation is like, it's not worth it because you won't be motivated all the time. So I'd say that's the biggest lesson. So developing discipline and not relying on being motivated. Question 30 is by Oyin, who's the co-founder of Neo Enterprise. She featured on episode 16. How did you realise it was the end of a chapter? Kind of answers that in a previous question, but essentially I just felt ready to transition, to do something else. I felt excited to throw myself into something completely new, and also, just ultimately, I was ready to just try something else and do something else. In other news, has been an integral part of my life, and I'm just excited to see what the next phase does. Yeah, I'd say that. Kelvin Okafor, I wrote a blog article on him. He's a stencil artist. And his question is, in the age of AI, where AI is so heavily influencing human interactions, what would you hope that people keep untainted when communicating with each other? I would say the importance of actually making time to see people, because there's the endorphins that actually come out of your body when you actually meet up with somebody that you love and that you care about can't be matched by talking on the phone or Instagram or all of those things. So I think that as AI continues to automate things, making an intentional effort to stay personally and physically connected is really important. Jade is the next question, and she featured on episode 18 and 19. And she now runs a very interesting YouTube channel called That Geography Channel. Her question is, if fear and doubt weren't an object, what would you be doing? I think I'd live abroad. I think I'd live somewhere else. And I think I would, and I say that knowing that I'm putting energy behind that right now. Because before I was worried about the sustainability of that, how will I get it done, and how will I sustain myself while I'm there, all of these type of things. But because I'm actually putting intention and energy behind that thought now, it actually isn't a fear, and it actually isn't a doubt. I'd also be dancing more, which I'm getting back into, as I know you know. But aside of that, I'm actually happy with how I'm controlling my life. The next question is from Maury, who's the founder of Maury Moves, and she's an event producer, good friend of mine, and she featured on episode 4, 10, and 11. And her question is, what does this season of transition mean to you? It means newness, it means excitement, it kind of feels like spring. So it actually feels kind of timely that this transition is happening in this actual calendar season. But it feels exciting more than anything, and I'm just hopeful about everything that it brings about, hopeful for all the new people I'll meet, relationships that will be forged, etc., and just continuing to come into more of myself. Julian is the founder of Yendi Skin, and he featured on episode 46. His question is, how do you cope when things are hard? I let it do what you need to do emotionally at first, because I think it's really important not to run away from that, because it's the truth of how you feel. After that, I get super practical. So I'm like, all right, cool. What can I do that's in my control right now that can help change the situation or rectify this situation? And I just do it. I don't allow it to consume me for very long, but instead I will, make an intentional effort to actually, think about what practically I can do right now to change the situation or make it easier. In answer to your question, you asked me, what do I do when things are hard? So think about what I can do to make it easier. So the next question 35, is from Tasha, one of my best friends and also the founder of Isabella Homes. She featured on episode 4 and 23. Her question is, who did you learn the most from out of all of your guests and why? I learned something different from everyone, and there isn't one person that I've learned the most from, I'd say. However, our group episode was really special because seeing what stood out to us all individually, about us all individually, was really special. and seeing and hearing, actually, more than seeing, hearing what everyone admired about each other. Because generally you don't really have that conversation in your friendship groups. You're kind of just talking about day-to-day things. Or unless something like monumental happened, that's when like affirmations happen. But in that circle and in that moment, it was really nice to hear like what everyone felt and admired about each other, and also seeing the reaction from the person who was being admired as we were all affirming them. That was really nice. I distinctly remember Abby, and she was like, "Oh guys, thanks." And like just seeing her react that way, yeah, that was really special. So I'd say that's what I learned most. Yeah, that's what I learned most. Laura Jane, who's a psychotherapist, and she featured on episode 41. Her question is, how are you feeling about endings in this current season, given that this is an ending with In Other News? It's definitely a mixture of emotions. There's definitely some sadness. And ultimately, I also see endings as like new beginnings. And I'm grateful that I do feel a sense of completeness with In Other News. Yes, there's always more that could be done, but I do feel like I did everything I needed to do. And I'm grateful that you've been part of this journey, as I am everybody else. And the final question is from Dara, who is the founder of Grace Magazine and featured on the Black in Quarantine Parents Edition. And her question is, how have you prepared for the new road ahead? Trust in God, firstly. And then like practically research, like practical actual planning, discipline and connectivity. I'm moving into a completely new space. So I'm moving into the women's health industry, and yeah, building new relationships in that space has been really interesting. And learning more about that space has also been really interesting. So like, yeah, setting foundations in that space is really important. And those three things I'd say are the things that I've practically done to prepare for the road ahead. There's only so much you can prepare, but no risk, no reward. So there's also a part of like just throwing myself into it, man. So yeah, that's what I'd say I've done to prepare for the road ahead. So yeah, this is definitely the end of an era. And ultimately, I want to thank every single person who has come onto this podcast or had me write about them or extended a PR invite to me or sent content for me to share, listen to the podcast, watch the podcast, encourage me in the journey, etc. Celebrating Black British brilliance has been like one of the highest honours for me. And what's next is super exciting. More on that in due time. But ultimately, based on how I feel about the essence of In Other News, this is not a goodbye, but it's more of a pause. It's more of a hold on, pause. So yeah, thank you so much to everyone who submitted a question. And to those of you that didn't get around to submitting a question, much love and respect to you as well. And yeah, you've been listening to In Other News, the podcast. Until next time.
No, yeah, sure.